Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I'm your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Before we get started today, I would like to send a very special thank you out to our latest patrons on patreon.com/history of the papacy, Vocar at the Antioch level, and Alexander, who is also at the Antioch level. Thank you so much, Vocar and Alexander, for supporting the history of the papacy on Patreon. If you would like to support the show, that's a great way to do it. Speaking of Patreon, I publish occasionally bonus content on Patreon to give you a little taste of what you can get on Patreon if you're a member. Here is some of that bonus content, and I picked two bonus episodes that happen to be on British and Celtic Christianity. One episode, the first episode, will be on the fall of British Christianity in one specific part of the British Isles, particularly England, what would become England. And then the episode after that is a little bit of discussion of Brendan the Navigator. So both of those episodes were originally only available on patreon.com/history of the papacy. You can get a little taste of them, but if you really enjoy those and you like the bonus content, I have a lot of episodes in the works for bonus episodes. As with everything else, it's hard to always get those bonus episodes out, but look forward to them. This also buys me a little bit of time. I have many episodes that are in various states of being finished. I'm going to finish out this 10th anniversary special pretty soon. Then we'll move on to the next series. So if you have feedback and input on what you would like to hear in the next series, I'm kind of on the fence on what to do next, but I'd love to hear what you would love to hear in a next series of the history of the papacy. So definitely send me those ideas to steve@a2zhistorypage.com, Facebook, any other way you can think of getting in touch, but I'd love to hear it. So thank you very much and enjoy these bonus episodes. Today we have a short piece of Roman Celtic Christianity in what would become England in 10 minutes or less. Now, where this episode came from was basically I've been researching, ironically enough, the 19th century papacy, but what was going on in England really impacted those times. As I got digging, I just learned more and more about how the church in England was so unique in what's going on in Christianity all throughout history. And so I wanted to start looking at chunks of why that history was so unique. And we're going to start off in Roman times because that's when Christianity started there. We did an entire series with Dr. Carly McNamara on the history of Celtic Christianity for more detail. What we really didn't talk about, though, was the Romano-British Church in what would become England. The focus was more on Ireland and then Scotland in the 400s going forward. But let's talk about actual Britain in the 300s and a bit earlier. I mean, really, Christianity would have spread into Britain the same way it did everywhere else. First, it would have gone into the major cities among the so-called middle classes, the merchants and the traders. There would have been some spread into the upper classes and then some spread into the slaves and the lower classes as well. Britain was really and at least at that time, the furthest point out there in the Roman Empire. So Christianity had less of an impact there than it did in other areas. If we just look back for a second, Christianity's nucleus is in and around the Holy Land and Jerusalem, and it just keeps spreading out in waves from there. And it's really the closer you are to that Heimat of the Middle East, the more Christians there were, and there was less and less as you spread out outside of the Jewish diaspora and into more Greco-Roman pagan areas. We really don't hear much about the church in Romano Britain. And that's why we're talking about it today. The entire history of the Church of England and Great Britain is strange, and that strangeness will carry us all the way through to the 1800s. As I was saying, the Roman British Church was really light on the ground, but it existed. There were bishoprics in all the major Roman cities of London, York, Colchester. They had different names, but those are the modern iterations. So there was a small but not insignificant number of Christians. Scholars can deduce, or at least make some wild assumptions, that there were some number of Christians in the smaller towns and villages as well. There is some archaeological evidence of church building in some of the smaller to medium-sized Roman cities. The 300s was a relative growth period for both Christianity and the general society of Gaul and Britain. The Romano-British Church was Orthodox, meaning no heresies of any point. It didn't really subscribe to Marcionism or anything like that. It was pretty much straight down the line Orthodox Catholic Christianity. Proto-Orthodoxy, you might call it. The church there was a bit small, and it appears to be a bit disorganized as well. Again, archaeological evidence that Christian ideas were being overlaid and syncretized with British religious practices. Not necessarily in a bad way, in ways that's just these things normally went down at that time period, but maybe a little bit more in Romano Britain. Then we get into Pelagius, who was the inventor of Pelagianism. Now, we've talked about Pelagianism a lot in past episodes. The West and the Western Church considered him a heretic. He was arch enemies with Augustine of Hippo. The East was a bit more understanding of him, and at least personally, and he didn't get condemned in the East the way he was out and out condemned in the West, but he made his name, his initial name at least, in Romano Britain. So that's the real short story of the Roman Church and the Church in general in Britain up until the 300s. And now we start to roll into the 400s and things get a bit more interesting and they begin to change. The Western Roman Empire was on a slight uptick during the 300s. The building up of the church, the economy of the society in the West was going up, but it was all built on weak foundations. Roman Britain and Gaul are similar in many ways, and both suffered massive invasions. Britain maybe more so because it was on the periphery. Britain was invaded by Picts from the north side of Hadrian's Wall and Saxon tribes from the continent. In 410, the Roman central government told Britain that they were on their own. They had to take care of themselves because all the legions were being pulled from Britain to go fight on the continent. So I won't get into all the details, but I'm sure you're at least aware of the broad strokes of what happened at this time. And my guess is you know more than the broad strokes if you're listening to this type of podcast. Now, the Romano-British nobleman named Vortigern took over the situation there. And there's so much to say about this guy Vortigern and Arthurian legends. That's a different story for a different day. But the short story is the Picts were really picking apart the Roman British. The Romano-British did the best they could, and really the best they could do was hire Germanic, Anglo-Saxon, Jutlanders, which were Danes of some sort, Frisian mercenaries from the continent for protection against the Picts. These Germanic Saxon tribes were not Christian of any sort, unlike other Germanic tribes at this time. They were completely pagan, and these tribes saw an opportunity. Why work for the weakened Romano-British regime when the Germanic-Saxon coalition could just take them over? So many different theories on this invasion and takeover exist, but that's the thing in the broadest strokes. The Germans were brought in to protect the Romano-British, and they were paid to do so. But as sometimes happens with mercenaries, when they see a place ripe for the pickings, they're the muscle, you just take over. And we can see, we meaning the scholars, see a really clear evidence of what happened to Christianity in Romano Britain. The whole institution of the Roman Catholic, Western, Latin church just gets completely wiped off the map. The Romano-British were subjugated, and the standard story is that they were wiped out, the complete genocide. That's probably not the complete case, but there was something to that. The Celts, these Romano-British Celts, were pushed aside or brought into the household as slaves or subservient people. So basically their culture, religion, language completely pushed to the margins, even if they are inside of the Germanic society. Linguists like John McWhorter say that the Celtic language made a huge but not easily seen mark on the Anglo-Saxon language. Again, that's a different story for a different day, but fascinating. The church as an organization was completely wiped out. Christianity survived and thrived in Ireland, as we saw in our Celt series with Dr. McNamara. But in Britain, it's stayed way under the surface, but so did more traditional religious elements, because Christianity just was never that embedded and established in Romano-British culture. And again, the overlord Germanic barbarians were pagans, so they were suppressing things as well. There's some unique characteristics of the fall of Roman Britain compared to Roman Gaul. Christianity just didn't get that strong foothold in Britain. In Gaul, Christianity seeped much more so into the fabric of society, and it went more widely and more deeply. There was more buildings of churches, more bishoprics into more areas and more rural areas. There were great leaders like John Cassian, Martin of Tours, and many other big names, you might say, who spread Christianity. The Germanic groups that flooded into Gaul were really a barbarian of a different flavor as well. The Germanic tribes that conquered Gaul were predominantly Christian, especially if we think the Franks. Some were Arian, some were semi-Arian, and sure, they disagreed with the Orthodox Christians they conquered. But hey, I mean, at the end of the day, they were all Christians. There were some persecutions in some cases, but really not many at all. And the Franks were actually Orthodox Christians. After a time, the Franks became the new bosses, and they really upset the apple cart in their own way, but not as far as religion went. So this leaves us with the situation where institutional Roman, Catholic, Orthodox Christianity became completely extinct in what would be called Anglo-Saxon lands, or eventually England. Let's just briefly move into the next phase in Christianity in England, and then build on why Christianity was so distinct in England and how it would eventually lead us to the Oxford movement in the distant future. We'll get into this more in future episodes. So by the early 400s AD, the pagan Anglo-Saxons were in the process of conquering the island of Britain. The established church was pretty much done in Britain. The pagan Anglo-Saxons pushed the Celts to the margins, and the Celts probably stayed Christian in some way. They continued their native Celtic religion and even adopted and adapted some forms of Anglo-Saxon German paganism, all synchronized into one new flavor to the Christianity in England. They also were getting constant contact from the Celts in Ireland, and there was a growing Christian community in pagan Anglo-Saxon England. This will eventually lead us to our episode on the Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons and the other Germanic peoples of England, but that's going to have to wait until next time. Oh, can I get your attention for just a second? A great way to support the History of the Papacy podcast is by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits for supporting the show on Patreon. The most important, though, is being included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the list of bishops commemorated in their order of precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you will be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Who were the first Europeans to travel to North America? If you want to start a fight with your history friends and nerds, ask this question. You'll surely get a fight, but maybe they are all wrong after all. Welcome back to the History of the Papacy in 10 minutes or less. At least we try, definitely no more than 15 minutes. This episode is a little addendum to our series on early British Christianity with Dr. Carly McNamara and others. I thought I would share the story of one of the founders of early Christianity, but who also had a really interesting life otherwise, and that's Brendan the Navigator, Saint Brendan the Navigator. Brendan's story is complicated. He's considered one of the 12 apostles of Ireland. He started many monasteries around the island, and there's many places named after him. Scholars are fairly certain he lived from the late 400s to the mid 500s AD. Just that would make him an interesting footnote for this whole Celtic British Christianity series. You'd be like, that's interesting, and let's move on. But there's a little bit more. The fact that Brendan was instrumental in the foundation of Christianity in Ireland during late antiquity isn't the really interesting part, though. Especially this whole idea of the navigator part of his name. That's the part of his story that has a lot more staying power. He gets this name, the Navigator, from a text written in and around the 800s or 900s AD. The story of Brendan's extensive travels comes from the text Navigatio Sancti Brendani Abbatis, the voyage of St. Brendan the Abbot. And as I said earlier, it's probably from as early as the very early 800s, but could have been from as late as the 900s. And there's several copies of this text that exist, and all with slightly different details. They all have pretty much the same gist, though. So, the gist of the story is Brendan gathers somewhere between 12, maybe 14, maybe 150 followers, and even some non-Christians to try and find the Terra Re Promissionis, in other words, paradise. What they thought was they just jump in a boat, sail to paradise. So pretty much what this group does of intrepid sailors, they island hop from one place to the next. They hit an island, they pray, they fast, they feast. The group has its ups, it has its downs. They're always taken care of, though, by God's graces. They land on an island that's actually a gigantic sea creature, and they burn out of there as fast as they can. Eventually, Brendan and his crew find a beautiful island and stay there for a bit, but then they're drawn back home. The travelogue of Brendan isn't really intriguing. Now, the fact of the matter is, the travels of Brendan almost certainly didn't happen. For one reason, the earliest account was written at a minimum of 200 years after Brendan died, and potentially way more than that. The importance is in the detail of the story. Now, this is not a hagiography in the classical sense of Brendan did this, Brendan did that, died a martyr, didn't, performed miracles, etc. It's not that. It taps into an Irish literary genre called the Imrama. Imrama is a travel story where a hero, or in this case a saint, visits unbelievable and incredible places under incredible circumstances. Even though it's not an Imrama, think of something like the Odyssey. The Navigatio of Brendan was a theological tract. The people in the story, Brendan and his crew, are searching for paradise, and they go through challenges and ordeals to get there. The story is completely packed full of biblical references, and it uses all of the Christian number schemes of threes and multiples of threes and sevens. Just some examples. They travel for 3 days and arrive on the 9th hour. They do things for 40 days. They spent Easter to Pentecost on an island. You get the drift. They also describe a 3 months open sea travel. So we can establish that this was clearly a theological treatise or a tract. It was meant to teach us something theologically, biblically, religiously, and entertain us too. That doesn't mean there isn't some history to mine from this voyage of Brendan. And there's a lot of history we can get from it. For one, the descriptions of the boats, the voyage or the navigatio of Brendan clearly describes that boats that were used in Ireland during that time. The Irish used wooden frame boats with oxhide hulls soaked in tar with a small mast. This is a form of a boat called a currach, which is a traditional Irish sailing vessel. Now, a fellow back in the 1970s named Tim Severin actually built a currach that was close to what was described in the Navigatio of St. Brendan. Now, Severin knew there would be some issues, such as oxhide traditionally does not hold up well in salt water. He did a massive amount of research. He consulted all the right people in the leather tanning industry, in saddle making industry, leather working, building of boats, and he found an ancient leather tanning procedure that made hides, once they were coated in tar, that were incredibly durable and did very well in salt water. Severin became sort of a less famous Kon-Tiki man. Severin sailed across the entire North Atlantic Ocean in this boat, and there's it looks a little rough in our day and age, but it must have been very cool to watch in the 1970s of a documentary that shows his entire journey, and it's pretty awesome. I highly suggest you go watch it. It's available on YouTube, and I'll link to it in the show notes. But he sailed from Ireland to Newfoundland in Canada. He made it, and his whole crew made it alive. One person had to be taken off the boat because they got really sick or something, but it wasn't like so I guess if they were doing that back in the 600s or whatever, he would have just died. But they had some technology that helped them, at least 1970s technology, to help them in this voyage. But it showed that it was completely doable. Kind of like Kon-Tiki Man showed that the type of boat that he made, it was doable. Didn't mean it happened, but it was doable. Again, this is saying that I'm not saying that Brendan actually went to these places, But that doesn't mean that other Irish monks didn't hop into similar boats and try and make it to paradise, or maybe just get out of Ireland. These Irish monks acted very much in the way that the desert monks of St. Anthony of Egypt fame worked. They would go out into the middle of the desert to try and get away from people. And the Irish monks, there's evidence they were doing this too, going to these far off islands that we all often associate with the Vikings, like Iceland and the Faroes. But these Irish monks were doing it at the same time and even earlier. And then the fact is, the Irish monks, they settled in hermitages on all of these islands off the British coast, all the way to Iceland, as I said before. And the Vikings reported seeing them, and they called these monks papar, based kind of on Pope. The Irish monks beat the Vikings to almost everywhere the Vikings eventually settled. A little bit later on, 1,000-ish odd years later, the Spanish and the Portuguese during the Age of Discovery had a bit of a mania trying to find the islands that Brendan visited, and they claimed to have found plenty of them too. And really the question for me comes to mind, did these Irish monks blaze a trail all the way to the New World ahead of the Vikings? Severin showed it was possible, but there's no evidence to show that the Irish monks actually did travel that far. Maybe Brendan himself didn't make it to North America. That being said, the whole purpose of this book about him, the Navigatio, wasn't an exact travel log. It was a theological text, but even though that text isn't an exact rendering of a real adventure, it serves as a springboard to so many other aspects of culture, religion, and thought and technology of that day and centuries later. Before we go, let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have, at the Alexandria level, Roberto, William B., Brian, Christina, Alex, Augustus, Judy, and Max. At the Constantinople level, we have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, who are all magnificent and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Amma the Great, Geoffrey the Great, Frederick the Great, and Jim the Great. With that, I hope you've enjoyed this piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.